On the subject of rebirth. George Gurdjieff said on occasion that many things appear in the Gospels about the inner teaching on man's nature and possibilities, but the essential points are usually omitted. They are either entirely left out, or given in the wrong order, hence appearing to be without connection. In the following extract from Gurdjieff's talks, 3 main ideas are spoken of: death, birth, and sleep. Everyone knows the New Testament says that someone can be reborn, born again, born anew, or born from above, as literally interpreted. For example, Christ says to Nicodemus, "Unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." See John, chapter 3, verse 3. This means in the language of the work, that someone cannot enter the conscious circle of humanity unless they are born anew, or born of this work. Strictly speaking, the work would say, unless they are born, because physical birth or physical incarnation is not being born in an esoteric sense. When an individual ceases to be mechanical, when they become conscious, when real I appears in them, then they are considered as man. In the 7 categories of men given in the work, numbers 1, 2 and 3, which comprise the bulk of humanity, belong to the circle of mechanical being, the circle of confusion of tongues, ergo Babel, where no one can ever agree, and no one can understand the other. We could note here that those who are born agree with one another and understand one another, for the 2 things are the same, because among conscious humanity there is understanding. We seek in the work to learn a common language, in order to understand one another a little better. We seek ultimately to be born, but in order to be born we must first die, and in order to die we must first awaken. Christ in the words attributed to him says simply, "A man must be born again before he can enter the kingdom of God." In another place he says, "We must awaken," which was translated as watch, and pray. In another place Christ says, "Except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone." See John, chapter 12, verse 24. We can see in what follows how things are wrongly arranged, indeed as if by people who did not really understand what they were shown. Suppose the teaching had been clear in the Gospels, that one must awaken before they can do anything else, and that in this is included becoming self-conscious of what they are like. One would imagine that in that case the whole course of exoteric Christianity would have gone differently. If we pause and think for a moment, we can see how impossible it is to die to oneself, unless we awaken to ourselves, however painful the awakening might be. Remember too where it is said that C influences, which come directly from conscious mankind, are always turned into B influences when they pass out into life. From those schools which were connected with Christ, nothing emerged into outer life for at least half a century. It is only within the atmosphere of a school that C influences can be really preserved. Without this environment, people will adapt them to themselves and to their level of understanding, to what they think is either right or wrong. The consequence is that essential points are missed, things are wrongly arranged, all harsh things are left out, and things that seem incredible from a life point of view are also omitted. Furthermore, everything is adulterated with general prejudice, common customs, and moral views of the time. Then we must remember that in those days every manuscript had to be copied by hand, and the scribes would naturally alter sentences that they did not agree with, or misunderstood, that they would insert things they thought ought to have been said, and so on. C influences cannot exist in life and always turn into B influences. Our mind is based upon its senses and has to be raised so that, for example, it no longer thinks in terms of yes and no about everything. Gurdjieff said during these talks, "I am often asked questions with regard to various texts, parables, and so on from the Gospels. In my opinion, the time has not yet come for us to speak about the Gospels because this requires more knowledge. However, from time to time we could take certain Gospel texts as points of departure for discussion. This will teach us to treat them in the right way and above all, to realize that in the texts known to us, the most essential points are usually missing. To begin with then, let's take then a text about seed which must die in order to be born. Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. This text has different meanings and we shall often return to it. But first it is necessary to know the principle contained in the text in its full measure, as applied to mankind. There is a book of aphorisms which has never been published and probably never will be. This is mentioned with regard to the meaning of knowledge, and quoted here is one aphorism from the book with regard to what is being spoken of now, where the book says the following: "A man may be born, But in order to be born, he must first die, and in order to die, he must first awaken. In another place it mentions, when a man awakens he can die, when he dies he can be born. We must find out what this means. To awake, to die, to be born. As these are three successive stages. If one studies the Gospels attentively, they can see that references are often made to the possibility of being born, several mentions are made of the necessity of dying, and there are many allusions to the need for awakening. Watch, for ye know not the hour, and so on. These three possibilities, to awake or not to sleep, to die and to be born, are not set down in connection with one another. Nevertheless, this is the whole point. If someone dies without having awakened, then they cannot be born. If someone is born without having died, they may become an immortal thing. Thus the fact that they have not died prevents someone from being born, the fact of their not having awakened prevents them from dying, and should they be born without having died, they are prevented from being. We have spoken about the meaning of being born, which relates to the beginning of a new growth of essence. The beginning of the formation of individuality, the beginning of the appearance of one indivisible I. However, in order to be able to attain this, or at least to begin to attain it, someone must die, that is, they must free themselves from 1,000 petty attachments and identifications which hold them in the position in which they find themselves. They are attached to everything in their life, attached to their imagination, attached to their stupidity, attached to their suffering. Possibly to that suffering more than to anything else. We must free ourselves from this attachment, which in Buddhism is referred to as samsara, being caught in the weeds. Attachment to things and identifying with them keep alive 1,000 useless eyes in us. These eyes must die in order that the big I may be born. But how can they be made to die because they do not want to die, for everything has within it the will and intent to survive. It is at this point that the possibility of awakening comes to our rescue. To awaken means to realize one's nothingness, to realize one's complete and absolute mechanicalness and our complete and utter helplessness. It is not sufficient to realize this philosophically in words. It is necessary for an individual to realize it in clear, simple and concrete facts, in their own narrative. When a person begins to know themselves a little, they will see in themselves many things that are bound to horrify them. For as long as they are not horrified at the self, they know nothing about themselves and are bound up in vain glories. Until they decide to throw this all off, to put a stop to it and to let go. Many long and failed efforts, however, must be made, so we feel that we cannot do this, and so everything remains just as it was. Here we see our impotence, our helplessness, and our deject nothingness. Or again, when someone begins to know themselves, they see that they have nothing that is their own, that all they have regarded as their personality, their mojo, their tastes, their views, thoughts, convictions, habits, even faults and vices, all these are not their own, but they have been borrowed from somewhere else, preformed. In feeling this, a person may feel their nothingness. And in feeling their nothingness, they should see themselves as they really are, not for a second, not for a moment, but constantly, and never forgetting it. This continual consciousness of our nothingness and of our helplessness will eventually give us the courage to die, and that is to die not merely mentally, or in our consciousness, but to die to that life, to that story, and to renounce eternally those aspects of ourselves that are either unnecessary from the point of view of inner growth, or which hinder it. These aspects are first of all our false I, and then all the fantastic ideas about our individuality, will, consciousness, capacity to do so, assumed powers, initiative, determination, and so on. We need to understand, and always to bear in mind, that in this work we are not trying to remain as we are, but to change. That change does not mean remaining such as we are. All change is inner, and starts from the inner, from beginning to see what we are really like. No one can remain the same as they are, and yet change. Buffers, attitudes, pictures of oneself, mechanical behavior, typical forms of internal considering, of making accounts against others, all our ideas about life, ways of thinking and forms of self-estimation, above all, the ways in which we identify. All these things in ourselves must change, if you are going to change. You cannot, as long as you hold on to your buffers and ingrained ways of taking and judging things, your self-esteem and your typical reactions become changed in yourself. Even if you go into a desert and live on a glass of water a day in some cave. To change, it is necessary that people work on themselves. Then try to separate from what they are, to observe themselves in accordance with what this work says.